The night Roscoe Weston decided he was done with living, the wind came down off the Colorado Rockies like something personally angry at him, rattling the shutters of his small ranch house so hard that two of them blew clean off their hinges and skidded across the frozen mud of his yard. He did not go after them. He sat instead in the wooden chair beside his cold fireplace, a glass of whiskey balanced on his knee, and he stared at the ash in the grate and thought about how 40 years could feel like both nothing and everything at the same time. 40 years, and what did he have to show for it? A cattle ranch in the foothills outside of Durango, Colorado, that was 3 bad seasons away from being the bank's property instead of his. A house with only 1 lamp lit because he had stopped seeing the point of lighting more. 2 working horses where there used to be 9. And a grave marker on the eastern edge of his property, weathered enough now that you had to be standing close to read the name carved into it. Clara. Clara Weston, née Fairmont, age 31, taken by fever in the summer of 1881. That had been 4 years ago, and Roscoe still hadn't moved her rocking chair from beside the window where she used to sit in the evenings and watch the last light go out of the sky over the San Juan Mountains. He hadn't been able to bring himself to do it. The chair sat there like a question he couldn't answer, facing a window that looked out over land that had once felt like possibility and now just felt like weight. He was 40 years old. He was alone. And the wind was taking the shutters off his house one by one, and he didn't care. That was the night of November the 4th, 1885. The very next morning, she knocked on his door. He heard it first as part of a dream he was having, a dream about the war, which was another thing he tried not to think about, those 2 years in the Union cavalry that had given him good horsemanship and bad nights. Then he heard it again, 3 deliberate knocks, and he came fully awake in the wooden chair where he'd fallen asleep around midnight, still holding the whiskey glass, which had thankfully emptied itself onto the floor rather than onto him. The knock came a 3rd time. Roscoe set the glass down on the mantel, pressed both hands against his lower back, and straightened himself up with the particular agony of a man who had slept in a chair at 40, which is considerably more punishing than sleeping in a chair at 20. He ran a hand over his jaw, felt the roughness of 2 days' worth of beard, and crossed the floor to the door. He opened it. The woman standing on his porch was not anyone he recognized, which was the first thing he registered. The second thing he registered was that she was soaking wet, her dark hair plastered in strips across a pale face that was trying very hard to look composed and failing somewhat at the edges. She wore a brown traveling coat that had not been designed for standing out in a Colorado November rainstorm, and she was holding a carpet bag in one hand and a piece of paper in the other, and she looked at him with eyes the color of Winter Creek water, which is to say gray and clear and not entirely warm. "Are you Roscoe Weston?" she said. Her voice was steady. He would remember that later, how steady her voice was when everything else about her was drenched and shivering and probably terrified, though she was working hard to hide the terrified part. "I am," he said. "My name is Edith Talmadge," she said. "I've come from Springfield, Missouri. I was told you were looking for a housekeeper." Roscoe stared at her for a full 3 seconds. The cold air came through the open door and moved around him like water, and in the yard behind her, he could see that the rain had led up to a thin gray drizzle, and that her horse, a brown mare with a white blaze, was standing at his fence post with her head down and her ears back, and the general demeanor of a creature who had been having a very bad week. "I haven't advertised for a housekeeper," he said. Something flickered in her gray eyes there, and gone so fast he might have imagined it. "Your neighbor, Mr. Caldwell. He told me in town that you'd had a loss and might be in need of help around the property. He said you were a decent man and that the work would be honest." Roscoe thought about Floyd Caldwell, who was his nearest neighbor at 3 miles and who had a habit of interfering in other people's lives with the cheerful certainty that he knew best, a habit Roscoe had alternated between appreciating and resenting for the better part of a decade. He looked at the woman on his porch, Edith Talmadge. from Springfield, Missouri, which was a long way to come on the word of a man she'd probably spoken to for 10 minutes in a general store. "You came all the way from Missouri on Floyd Caldwell's word," he said. "I came all the way from Missouri because I needed to come," she said. "Mr. Caldwell's word was the direction, not the reason." That was an interesting answer. It was the kind of answer that suggested a story behind it, the kind of story people told in pieces slowly, once they decided whether or not they trusted you. He recognized that quality because he had a story like that himself. He stepped back from the door. "You'd better come in," he said. "You and your horse both look like you've had a hard night." The inside of the house was not, Roscoe was now acutely aware, in a state that reflected well on him. There were dishes in the dry sink that had been there for several days. The floor had not been swept since sometime in October. The cold fireplace was full of ash because he had not bothered to clean it out before attempting to build the previous evening's fire, a task he had abandoned in favor of the whiskey. The curtains on the windows were gray with dust, and Clara's rocking chair sat in the corner by the window, empty and accusatory. Edith Talmadge walked in, set her carpet bag down beside the door, and looked around the room with the careful eyes of a woman cataloging a situation rather than judging it. "I can have this in order within a day," she said. "2 days if the floor needs more than sweeping." "I didn't say I was hiring you," he said. "No," she agreed. "But you let me in out of the rain, which suggests you're not opposed to the idea." He looked at her standing there, still damp, still shivering slightly though she was controlling it well, and he felt something shift in his chest, something he couldn't quite name, not yet. It wasn't attraction, not exactly, not in that first moment. It was more like recognition, the way you feel when you hear a piece of music you've never heard before and somehow already know. "There's a room off the back," he said. "It's small, the stove in it works, I think." "I'll find out," she said. "The pay would be," he started. "Whatever is fair," she said. "I'm not here to make you poor, I'm here to work." He built a fire, eventually in the main fireplace, partly because the room needed it, and partly because it gave him something to do with his hands while he tried to decide what he made of this situation. Edith Talmadge went out to see to her mare, which she called Juniper, and by the time she came back inside, she'd found the broom leaning against the back wall and started on the floor without anyone asking her to. Roscoe watched her for a moment, then went out to check on his own horses, Abel and the gray one he called Prophet, and to do the morning feeding, and to give himself some space to think. Floyd Caldwell, he decided, was going to hear about this, but later. When he came back inside an hour later, the floor was swept, the dishes were washed and stacked, the curtains had been beaten and rehung, and Edith Talmadge was standing at his stove frying salt pork and corn cakes, and the smell of it hit him somewhere between his stomach and his heart. He couldn't remember the last time he'd come in from morning chores to the smell of food cooking. 4 years. 4 years since that had been a thing that happened in this house. He sat down at the table and didn't say anything for a moment. "I should tell you," he said, "that I'm not an easy man to work for. I've been told I keep too much to myself. I don't make much conversation." "That's all right," Edith said, sliding the corn cakes onto a tin plate and setting it in front of him. "I'm not here for conversation. I'm here to work." He watched her settle across from him at the table with her own plate, noticed that she'd served herself a smaller portion than she'd given him, and felt the sudden urge to correct that, which he didn't act on because he was still working out who this woman was and what she was doing at his table. "Where will you go," he said carefully, "if this doesn't work out? If I decide it isn't what I need?" She looked up from her plate and met his eyes directly, which he noticed because most people, when they had nowhere particular to go, tried to look like the answer to that question was somewhere other than the truth. "I'll figure something out," she said. "I always have." There was the story again behind her eyes. He didn't push. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that Roscoe hadn't expected, a rhythm that crept up on him before he'd had time to resist it. He rose at 5, fed and watered the horses, checked the fence line along the south pasture, and came in to find breakfast ready. Edith worked steadily through the mornings, cleaning and mending and organizing things that had been in disorder for so long he'd stopped seeing them. In the afternoons, she helped with the outdoor work, which he hadn't asked her to do but which she began doing anyway, with a matter-of-fact competence that told him she hadn't grown up in a drawing room. He found himself talking more than he'd planned. Not about anything large, not at first. About the weather, which in the Colorado foothills was always a subject of conversation, because it was always doing something dramatic and unexpected. About the horses, because she asked intelligent questions about them and actually listened to the answers. About the cattle, 12 head of a mixed longhorn and shorthorn stock that were his main income when they sold in the spring. She talked, too, in the same careful increments. She'd been born in Springfield, had a father who'd worked the railroads and a mother who died when Edith was 9. She'd been married briefly to a man named Thomas Talmadge who had gone to Kansas to stake a claim and had written back for a year and then stopped writing. She'd waited another year before accepting that the writing wasn't going to start again. She'd worked as a seamstress and then as a domestic, and then, when the woman she'd worked for in Springfield died and left the household to a son who had his own staff coming from back east, she had found herself at 34 years old with her savings, her carpet bag, her horse, and the wide West in front of her. 34. So she was 6 years younger than him. He found himself doing that arithmetic and then catching himself doing it and not being entirely sure why. She had not. She told him one evening when they were sitting at the table after supper with the fire going and the wind outside doing its usual Colorado business. She had not come west with any particular plan. She had come because there was nothing holding her in Missouri, and some instinct she couldn't quite articulate, told her that staying where she was would be a different kind of dying than the quick kind. He knew about that kind of dying. He recognized it the way you recognize the face of someone you've never met but who you've been told about for years. "What made you knock on my door?" he said. "There must have been other options in town." She considered the fire for a moment. "Mr. Caldwell said you'd lost your wife 4 years ago and that you were managing the ranch alone. He said he'd offered to help and you'd refused it every time." "I did," Roscoe said. "He said you were proud but not unkind." She looked up. "I've met plenty of proud men. They're not always the same thing as unkind, but it's rare enough that it seemed worth a cold ride out." He thought about that for a while. Then he said, "Floyd Caldwell has no business describing me to strange women." "No," she agreed, and the corner of her mouth moved just barely, and he realized it was going to be a smile before it got there. And the smile, when it arrived, was quick and real and entirely different from the careful, composed expression she wore the rest of the time. He felt that smile somewhere in his chest, which he didn't appreciate at all. He rode over to Floyd Caldwell's place the next Saturday, which was a crisp blue November day, the kind that Colorado produced to apologize for the ones where it tried to kill you. Floyd was mending a wheel on his wagon when Roscoe rode up, a broad, red-faced man of 55 who had been his nearest neighbor since Roscoe first came to this land in 1878, and who had an opinion on everything and offered it freely. "She showed up then," Floyd said, before Roscoe could say anything. "She showed up," Roscoe confirmed. "You might have told me you were sending her. You'd have said no." "I might have said no," Roscoe said. "That's my right." Floyd set down his wrench and looked at him with the direct, unabashed appraisal of a man who considered politeness a minor consideration compared to being right. "You've been closing down, Roscoe. Season by season, I've watched you do it. Clara's been gone 4 years and you've been going backward instead of forward. I don't need a housekeeper to stop going backward." "Maybe not," Floyd said, "but you need something, and she needed somewhere. It seemed like it made sense." Roscoe sat on his horse and tried to maintain an expression of dignified disapproval, which was difficult because Floyd was not entirely wrong and they both knew it. "What do you know about her?" he said. "Enough. She came through on the stage, asked around for work, heard about you. She's honest, Roscoe, you can see it in how she carries herself. And she's had a harder road than most without turning hard herself. He picked up his wrench again. That's rarer than it ought to be. Roscoe rode home and thought about that the whole way. December came and settled over the foothills with the seriousness that Colorado December always brought. The ground freezing solid, the creek at the north edge of the property going quiet under ice, the mountains beyond turning white so thoroughly that on clear mornings they looked like they were made of light. He and Edith developed an easy efficiency together, the way two people will when they are both practical by nature and spend enough hours in the same spaces. She learned which fence posts needed attention before the spring thaw. He learned that she liked her coffee strong enough to be taken seriously, and that she had a habit, in the evenings, of reading by the lamp with such concentration that she sometimes didn't hear him come in from the barn. She had brought one book with her from Springfield. It was a novel, dog-eared and soft-covered, by a woman named Mary Wollstonecraft, and she read it the way people read things they already know but need to come back to. He asked her about it once, and she said it was about the rights of women and the idea that a woman's mind was not less than a man's simply because it lived in a woman's body. He said he had never thought it was. She looked at him with the careful eyes she used for evaluating whether she believed what people told her, a look she'd clearly developed from necessity rather than cynicism. And then she seemed to decide she believed him and went back to her book. He found himself at the back of the barn one afternoon, sitting on an overturned bucket after he'd finished repairing a bridle, thinking about things he'd decided not to think about anymore. He was thinking about how the house felt different now. Not just cleaner, though it was that. Different in some quality he was finding it hard to put language to, something about the air inside it, something about coming in through the door and hearing small sounds, the clink of dishes, the scrape of a chair, the quiet hum she sometimes did when she was working and thought she was alone. He was thinking about how he had told himself, the night before she arrived, that he was done. That 40 was too old to start again. That whatever he'd had with Clara, that particular grace of sharing your life with another person, was something that happened to young men, and that he had been lucky to have it once and unlucky to lose it early, and that the remaining years were simply something to be gotten through rather than lived. He sat in the cold barn and thought about how wrong he might have been about that. He didn't do anything about it. He was a careful man by nature, and he was also aware that he was her employer and that she had come to him in need of work, and that the imbalance of that situation made it not his place to say anything. So he didn't say anything. He went back inside and ate supper, and asked her if the latch on the back room door was still giving her trouble, and she said it was, and he said he'd fix it tomorrow. The Christmas that year was a quiet one. Floyd Caldwell and his wife, Nora, came over on Christmas Eve for supper, which Edith cooked with a skill and warmth that made Nora Caldwell, who was a formidable cook herself and not given to easy praise, say that the venison stew was the best she'd had since her own mother made it in Ohio 30 years ago. Nora was a warm, sharp-eyed woman who had immediately taken stock of the situation between Roscoe and Edith, and who, unlike her husband, had the sense to not say anything about it directly, but instead spent the evening asking Edith questions about Missouri and watching Roscoe while he watched Edith answer them. After the Caldwells left, Edith cleared the dishes and Roscoe stacked the extra wood by the fire, and the room was quiet and warm, and outside the snow was coming down steady and thick, the kind that covered everything and made the world look brand new. "Thank you," he said, which was not something he said easily or often. She turned from the dry sink and looked at him. "For supper." "For this," he said, meaning the room, the warmth, the fire, the sense that Christmas was something happening in this house rather than something happening elsewhere to other people. "For all of it." She stood very still for a moment and something moved across her face that he couldn't quite read. "Thank you for letting me stay," she said. "I know it wasn't what you'd planned." "No," he agreed, "but not everything that's good is what you planned." She seemed to be considering several different responses to that, and in the end she chose none of them, just turned back to the dishes, and he went to bed and lay awake for longer than he should have. January brought a storm that lasted 4 days and kept them both inside more or less entirely, and in those 4 days something shifted between them, not dramatically, not in any single moment, but incrementally, the way the temperature shifts from fall to winter, 1 degree at a time until you realize you're somewhere entirely different from where you started. They talked. They talked more in those 4 days than in the previous 6 weeks, partly because there was nothing else to do and partly because by now they'd established enough of a foundation of trust that it was possible to say things that were actually true rather than things that were simply safe. She told him about Thomas Talmadge, told him the whole of it, not just the leaving but the years before, the way a marriage can feel like it's standing on solid ground until the day you look down and realize the ground stopped being solid some time ago, and you've just been pretending. She told him she'd known, before he left for Kansas, that something in him was already gone, and the Kansas trip was just making the geography match the truth. She said that knowing it hadn't made the waiting easier. He told her about Clara. He had not talked about Clara, not really, not the actual substance of what it had been, to anyone since she died. He told Floyd and Nora bits and pieces, practical things, the details of the fever, the decisions he'd had to make. He hadn't told anyone what it had actually been like to love Clara Weston, what specific quality of light she'd brought with her wherever she went, how she used to laugh at herself more readily than she laughed at anything else, how she'd been afraid of neither hard work nor honest emotion and how rare that was. Edith listened the way a person listens when they understand from the inside what you're talking about, not with the politely sad face people made when they were being sympathetic about something they couldn't quite reach, with real recognition. She sounds like someone worth missing, Edith said. She was, he said. She is. He looked at the fire. You never stop, you know, you don't get over it, not really. You just learn to carry it differently. Yes, Edith said quietly. I think that's true of all the losses that matter. They sat together in the firelight for a while after that, not talking, just sitting, and it was a different kind of quiet than the quiet that had been in the house before she came. It was company instead of emptiness. The storm broke on a Thursday morning, and the world outside was white and clean and blinding, and Roscoe went out to dig a path to the barn while Edith made breakfast, and he worked steadily through the cold, his breath coming out in clouds, and he was thinking clearly for the first time in longer than he could remember. He had told himself 40 was too old. Standing in the snow with a shovel and the mountains white against a blue sky, he was starting to think that was the loneliness talking, not the truth. February came, and with it something Roscoe hadn't expected, a complication in the form of a man named Arthur Denning. Arthur Denning owned the largest operation in the valley, a cattle empire by local standards, 1,200 head to Roscoe's 12, with a ranch house that had glass windows and a parlor and a hired cook, and 3 men working the land full-time. He was 48 years old and had been a widower for 2 years, and had, in that time, begun making himself noticeable to every single woman within 40 miles of Durango. He had the money and the manner that made men like him believe that what they wanted and what they were going to get were the same thing. He came riding up to Roscoe's property on a Tuesday afternoon, which was when Roscoe was out checking the herd and Edith was alone in the house. Roscoe came back in to find her at the stove, her posture slightly different from usual, just a small tightness across her shoulders that he'd learned to notice. "Someone come by," he said. "Arthur Denning," she said. He set his hat on the hook by the door. What did he want? He said he'd heard there was a woman working out here, and he wanted to make sure I was being treated fairly. She said it with a flat, precise dryness that told him exactly what she thought of Arthur Denning's stated concern for her welfare. He also mentioned 3 times that he had a considerably larger property than this one. Did he now? Roscoe said. He asked if I would like to come for supper at his place on Saturday and see what a well-run ranch looked like. She turned to face him. I told him I was satisfied with my current situation. Good, Roscoe said, and he said it with more edge in his voice than he'd intended, which she noticed. He could tell by the slight lift of her eyebrows. He sat down at the table and looked at his hands for a moment. He'll come back, he said. He's that kind of man. I know, she said. I've met that kind before. If he bothers you, I can handle being bothered, she said. But thank you. He looked up and met her eyes, and he held them for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and the moment stretched between them like something being slowly, carefully pulled. Then she turned back to the stove, and he went to wash up, and neither of them said anything more about it. Arthur Denning came back the following Saturday, this time when Roscoe was home, and rode up to the fence with the easy confidence of a man who expected his presence to be welcome. He was well dressed for a ranch call, good hat, good coat, the kind of grooming that announced money the way a shop sign announces a business. Roscoe met him at the fence. "Weston," Denning said pleasantly. "I came to call on your housekeeper. I hope you'll excuse the intrusion." "She told you she wasn't interested," Roscoe said. "She's a woman alone in the world," Denning said. "I'm only trying to offer her better options." "Better by whose measure?" Roscoe said. Denning smiled the smile of a man who found other people's opposition vaguely amusing. "By any reasonable standard, Weston. You've got a struggling operation and 12 head of cattle. I've got a real future on offer." Roscoe looked at him evenly. He had spent 20 years not starting fights he didn't need to finish, and he wasn't going to change that now. But he also wasn't going to pretend this man was welcome. "She said no," Roscoe said. "In my experience, a woman saying no is the end of the conversation, not the beginning of a negotiation. I'd appreciate if you treat it as such." Denning studied him for a moment with flat appraiser's eyes. Then he nodded once, turned his horse and rode back toward the main road, and Roscoe watched him go and thought that this probably wasn't finished. Inside, Edith was standing at the window. She had watched the exchange. "You didn't have to do that," she said when he came in. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She looked at him with those clear gray eyes, and something in her expression was open in a way it hadn't been before, less carefully arranged, more honest. "Roscoe," she said, and the way she said his name was different, quieter, like she was testing the weight of it. "Edith," he said. They stood in the middle of the kitchen looking at each other, and the fire was going, and the room was warm, and the mountains outside the window were going pink with the afternoon light. And he thought that he had been wrong, back in November, in that cold, dark house with the empty fireplace. He had been wrong about what 40 meant, and what done meant, and what a man could and couldn't deserve. He was still working up to saying so when she said, "I think I need to tell you something." "All right," he said. "When I came here," she said, "I told you I came because I needed work. That's true, but it isn't the whole truth." She looked at the window for a moment, then back at him. "I came because I was afraid of what I was becoming, staying in Missouri, working in houses that weren't mine, shrinking myself down smaller and smaller until there was barely anything left. I came west because I needed to find out if there was still something in me worth growing." He waited. "I think there is," she said. "I think there's been room here for me to grow. And I think a large part of that is because you're the kind of man who makes room." She stopped. "I don't know entirely what I'm saying." "I think you're saying it just fine," he said. He crossed the room to where she was standing, not quickly, giving her time to step away if she wanted to, and she didn't step away. He stopped close enough that he could see the texture of the cold air still in her cheeks, and the steadiness in her eyes that had been there from the very first morning, from the moment she'd stood on his porch in the rain and given him her name like it was something solid she was putting in his hands. "I told myself I was too old to start over," he said. "I decided that the night before you showed up. I had actually sat down and decided it. And now," she said, "now I think I was talking like a fool," he said. 40 is not old, Edith, not if the right person knocks on your door." She reached up and put her hand against his jaw. against the beard he'd taken to keeping neater in recent weeks without entirely acknowledging why. And she looked at him with an expression that had everything in it: the wariness she'd earned, and the warmth that had survived it, and the hope that she'd carried all the way from Springfield, Missouri, on a horse named Juniper. He leaned down and he kissed her, gently, slowly, with the care of a man who had learned that some things are worth being careful with, and she kissed him back with the steadiness that was the most characteristic thing about her, and the fire behind them crackled, and outside the February light was turning everything gold. It wasn't like being 20. It wasn't the wild, uncomplicated falling of young people who have the luxury of not knowing how much they could lose. It was something different, something that had the weight of knowing behind it. Two people who had already loved and lost and survived it, and were choosing, with full awareness of what choosing meant, to try again. He thought that might be the braver kind of love, actually. March came in loud and wet, the way it always did, the snowmelt running down off the mountains and turning the creek into something enthusiastic, and Roscoe found himself moving through the days with a different quality of attention, the way the world looks when you've been living in a dim room and someone opens a window. He noticed things. The way the mud was starting to soften in the south pasture, which meant spring planting. The way Abel and Prophet had both put on good winter coats and were looking healthier than they had in 2 years, because Edith had been adding grain to their feed and keeping a closer eye on their teeth and feet than he had been. The way the 12 head of cattle had wintered better than expected. The way the house, which in November had felt like a mausoleum, now felt like a house. He and Edith were careful with each other in those early weeks, moving around what had happened between them with a kind of mutual delicacy, neither of them in a hurry, both of them aware that what was being built here was something that needed a solid foundation, and not just a romantic moment by a fireplace. They talked more. They argued sometimes, small productive arguments, about the best way to handle the south fence repair, about whether it was worth trying to add a few more head of cattle in the spring if the cash could be found, about books, because she lent him the Wollstonecraft and he read it and had opinions. He thought she was right that women's minds were equal to men's, and he said so. She said she appreciated that, but that his appreciation of it didn't change the world for women who didn't have the luck of landing employers who shared his view. He agreed that was true. She said the whole system needed changing. He said she wasn't wrong, but he wasn't sure how a cattle rancher in Colorado could contribute much to changing it. She said he could start by treating the women in his life as equals and work outward from there. He told her he'd been doing that. She said she knew, and that it was one of the reasons she was still there. Floyd Caldwell rode over in mid-March for what he claimed was a fence-line discussion, which it was briefly before he got around to the actual purpose of the visit, which was to look from Roscoe to Edith and back to Roscoe with unconcealed satisfaction and say, "Well, you two seem to be getting along." "Floyd," Roscoe said. "I'm just observing," Floyd said innocently. Edith smiled over her coffee cup, the quick real smile that Roscoe was coming to think of as his favorite thing in the county. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "your fence on the east side of your property near the creek has 3 posts that need replacing before the spring melt does any more damage. I noticed it when I was riding the boundary last week." Floyd blinked, slightly caught off guard by the shift in subject, and then grinned. "I'll get on that. Thank you, Miss Talmadge." "Mrs.?" she said quietly, and Roscoe noticed the slight hesitation in it, the word that still had complicated territory attached to it for her. After Floyd left, he found a quiet moment to say to her, "You can tell people whatever title you prefer. I won't think less of either one." She looked at him steadily. "What would you prefer?" she said. He thought about it. "I'd prefer," he said slowly, "that whatever title you use reflects something that's actually true about what this is." "And what is this?" she said. "Something I'd like to make permanent," he said, "if you'd be willing." She set down her coffee cup and looked at him for a long moment, and the March light was coming through the window at the angle that made her eyes look green at the edges instead of purely gray. "Ask me properly," she said. He pulled out a chair from the kitchen table and sat down, because doing this standing felt somehow wrong, like he hadn't thought it through. And then he took her hand, which was a capable, warm, unsentimental hand, the hand of a woman who had worked hard for every good thing she had, and he looked up at her and said, "Edith Talmadge, I am 40 years old and I am a better man than I was 6 months ago because you walked through my door in the rain and showed me that starting over wasn't the same thing as giving up. I would like very much to spend however many years I have left doing this with you. Will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and then she said, "Yes." Roscoe Weston, yes. He stood up and held both her hands, and she was laughing, just a little, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere deeper than amusement, from relief and joy and the specific pleasure of a good thing arriving after a long wait. And he was laughing too, which was something he hadn't done, actually laughed with his whole chest, in longer than he could calculate. They were married in April at the small church in Durango, which sat on a street that smelled of horse and sawdust and early spring mud. It was a small ceremony because that was what both of them wanted. Nora Caldwell had spent 2 weeks urging Edith to let her organize something grander, and Edith had thanked her warmly and declined just as warmly. And in the end the wedding had Floyd and Nora, the preacher, a man named Reverend Hayes who had a kind face and the direct manner of someone who'd seen both the best and worst of human nature in his work, and a woman named Dolores Reyes who ran the laundry in town and had become Edith's first real friend in Colorado. Dolores was a Mexican woman of 38 who had been in Durango for 8 years and who ran her laundry business with impressive efficiency, despite the fact that a number of her customers were considerably ruder to her than they should have been, on account of the same ignorant prejudices that made life harder for people who didn't look like the men who'd written the laws. She had a dry wit and a genuine laugh, and she had taken to Edith immediately, and Edith to her, and the friendship between them was already the kind that felt like it had been going on for years. Dolores stood beside Edith at the front of the church and held her small bunch of early wildflowers, and Floyd Caldwell looked like he might actually cry, which he would have denied vigorously if anyone mentioned it. Reverend Hayes read the words, and Roscoe put a ring on Edith's finger, a plain gold band he'd had made by the silversmith, and she put one on his, which she had chosen herself, and which he hadn't expected, and the having of it on his hand felt like being claimed in the best possible way, like being told you belong somewhere. They said their vows, both of them meaning every syllable, and when the Reverend said that Roscoe could kiss his bride, and he did, the small church felt warm and full despite having only half a dozen people in it. Outside afterward, in the April sunshine, Floyd slapped him on the back with enough force to stagger a smaller man, and Nora hugged Edith with genuine warmth, and Dolores produced a bottle of good wine from somewhere in her skirts, which was a mystery none of them investigated too closely, and they stood in the spring sunshine and drank to new beginnings. Roscoe looked at Edith standing in the light, his wife now, in her good blue dress that she'd made herself from fabric she'd had since Missouri, a dress she'd somehow kept good through all the traveling and working, the way she'd kept herself good through all of it. She was talking to Dolores, animated, the careful composure she carried in ordinary time relaxed into something more open and happy, and he thought that Floyd Caldwell, interfering and cheerful and entirely convinced of his own good judgment, had been absolutely right. Spring was busy in the way that spring on a cattle ranch always is, relentless and productive and demanding. The south fence got repaired. The cattle needed to be moved to the upper pasture once the grass came in. Roscoe made the decision, with Edith's input, to buy 3 more head at the spring auction in town, expanding the herd carefully, not beyond what they could manage but meaningfully enough to begin building toward something more than bare survival. The money was tight but not desperate, which was a different thing than it had been the previous fall, and the difference was partly better management and partly Edith's practical eye for where money was being wasted, and where it could be saved, and partly something less tangible, the way things that matter to you receive better attention than things you've given up on. She had not moved Clara's rocking chair. He'd noticed that early on and wondered at it. One afternoon in May, when they were both on the porch watching the evening settle over the mountains, he asked her about it. "I thought about moving it," she said, "but it seemed wrong to make that decision without talking to you." He looked at the chair through the window. "It should probably be moved," he said. "It belongs somewhere it's loved, not just somewhere it used to be loved." "Where would you like it?" she said. He thought about it. "Floyd and Nora's youngest girl is getting married in the fall," he said. "They might like to have it. It's a good chair." Edith nodded. "That's a good idea." And so that was settled quietly between them. He took the chair to the Caldwells the following weekend, and Nora cried a little, and Clara's chair went to young Margaret Caldwell's new household, where it would rock another generation, which felt right. Coming home that evening, he felt lighter than he had since 1881, which was not a betrayal of Clara, but rather what Clara would have wanted for him, because she had been that kind of person, generous enough to want the people she loved to be all right even in her absence. Summer on the Colorado ranch was the fullest season, long days of hard work that started before sunrise and ended after dark, but full in the way that meaningful work is full, a different quality of tired than the exhausted emptiness he'd been carrying. He and Edith worked side by side, and they were a good team, different in their approaches in ways that turned out to be complementary rather than conflicting. He was patient and methodical. She was quick-thinking and adaptable. He taught her things about cattle and horses that she didn't know, and absorbed her instruction without pride getting in the way. She learned things from him about the land itself, the way this particular piece of Colorado spoke if you were willing to listen to it. They also simply enjoyed each other, which he hadn't quite expected to say about himself again, and which was perhaps the best surprise of everything. They enjoyed being in the same room. They enjoyed the same kind of evenings, quiet ones, reading or talking or just sitting on the porch watching the light go through its evolutions. They made each other laugh, which was a particular grace. He found himself buying her a book of poetry from the bookseller who came through Durango in July. A thin volume of Walt Whitman that he'd heard was the kind of poetry that people who actually worked the land could hear something real in, and he left it on her pillow one evening without saying anything about it. And the next morning she came to breakfast with it in her hand and said, "Where did this come from?" And he said, "I thought you might like it." And she looked at him with an expression so unguarded and warm that it made something inside him press against his ribs. "I do like it," she said, "very much." "Good," he said, and they sat down to breakfast, and it was ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure, the way the best things tend to be. In August, Edith told him quietly over supper one evening that she thought she was expecting a child. He set down his fork. He looked at her and she was watching him with careful eyes, reading his response the way she read everything, attentively and without flinching. "Are you certain?" he said. "Fairly certain," she said. "I've spoken to Nora and she thinks so too." He was quiet for a moment. He had wanted children with Clara, and they'd tried, but Clara had had difficulties. Losses early that weren't talked about but that had been grieved privately and steadily between them. He had made his peace, or something like peace, with the idea that there would be no children. He had not expected to be sitting at this table at 40 years old hearing this. "Roscoe," Edith said, and her voice had a tentativeness he didn't usually hear from her. He looked at her and he said, "I'm very glad." And he meant it from the center of himself, from a place he hadn't expected to have access to again, a warmth so specific and genuine that it surprised him with its force. She exhaled just slightly, the small release of a breath that had been held while she waited for his answer. "Good," she said, "because I am too. Very." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him hold it, and they sat together in the summer evening light with the news of this new life settling around them like something luminous. He rode to Floyd Caldwell's the following Sunday and told him, because Floyd had been his neighbor and his friend and his unwitting matchmaker, and he was owed the news. Floyd sat down on his porch step when Roscoe told him and put his face in his hands and made a sound that took Roscoe a moment to identify as a man trying not to cry and losing. "Floyd," Roscoe said. "I'm fine," Floyd said from behind his hands. "I'm perfectly fine." "You're crying," Roscoe observed. "I'm not," Floyd said, lifting his face, which was red and wet. I'm very glad for you, Roscoe." "I know," Roscoe said. "Thank you for interfering." Floyd laughed then, the big barrel laugh that was his most characteristic sound. "You're welcome for interfering." Nora came onto the porch and Floyd told her, and she burst into unambiguous tears, which were much less complicated than Floyd's attempts to pretend he wasn't having them. And then she pulled Roscoe into a hug that he didn't entirely resist. Autumn came, and with it the cattle drive to Durango for the fall market, which was the primary income event of the year, and one that Roscoe managed with more optimism this year than he'd had in several seasons. The 15 head, the 12 originals plus the 3 additions, had done well over the summer, and the prices at market were decent. He came home with more in his pocket than he'd managed in 2 years. Not rich. This was a small operation, and ranching in Colorado was never easy, but enough to repair the root cellar and replace the broken window in the kitchen and still put something away against the winter. He did not tell Edith the exact amount because she would have made him put more away and spend less on the repairs, and the repairs were necessary. But he told her the general state of things was better, and she looked at the account book. He showed her and agreed and did not say anything about the window specifically, which suggested she'd noticed the prices and done the arithmetic and decided to let him have the window. He appreciated that. She was beginning to show by October, not dramatically, but unmistakably, and she had a quality about her in those months that he found himself watching, a particular kind of fullness, not physical only but something in the way she occupied the world, as if she had come into a certainty about her place in it that hadn't been there when she arrived. Dolers came out from town every few weeks to visit, which Roscoe encouraged, and which Edith counted on in the way you count on things that are genuinely good for you. The 2 women would sit at the kitchen table for hours, talking, laughing, arguing sometimes about politics and ideas, and what the world owed women and what women owed the world. And Roscoe would find reasons to be in or near the kitchen because he enjoyed the sound of Edith happy, full stop. Dolers had a particular kind of dignity that Roscoe respected, the dignity of a person who had been dismissed and overlooked and who had built something real anyway, and he made a point of treating her as the friend of the household that she was, not as something lesser, which she noticed, and which she commented on once to Edith, not realizing Roscoe was within earshot. "Your husband," Dolers had said, "looks at me like I'm a person." "He does that," Edith said. "He's annoyingly consistent about it." Dolers had laughed, and Roscoe had gone back to the barn with what he suspected was an embarrassing expression on his face. Arthur Denning had not, as Roscoe had predicted, considered the matter closed. He'd shown up in Durango on the day Roscoe and Edith were married and expressed, to anyone who would listen, his view that Roscoe Weston had taken advantage of a woman who'd come to him in a vulnerable position. This view had not found much purchase, partly because it was untrue and the people who knew Roscoe understood that, and partly because Edith herself, upon hearing it reported back to her, had gone directly to where Denning was holding court in the saloon and had told him, with the calm precision of a woman who was not afraid of him, that she had made her own choices and would thank him to stop pretending otherwise. Denning had gone red and then pale and then red again, and the saloon had been very quiet, and then he had left without another word, and the town had talked about it for a month with great appreciation. By November, he had married a woman from Denver who had money of her own and was apparently better suited to him, and the matter was closed. The winter of 1886 was fierce. It was a winter that tested ranches and people, and the relationships between them in the way that long, cold, isolated months will. They were snowbound for 2 weeks in January, which was hard but which they managed, Roscoe and Edith together, with the practical efficiency they'd developed, and the underlying warmth that made the house feel warm even when the wind was putting its shoulder against the walls. Edith was in her 8th month, and she was careful, not reckless. She had too much practical sense for recklessness, but she refused to be treated as if the pregnancy made her helpless, which he had never actually attempted to do, having learned fairly early in their acquaintance that suggesting Edith Weston was incapable of something was a reliable way to ensure she did it immediately. They talked about names. He had preferences and she had preferences, and the overlap was smaller than either of them would have predicted, but they arrived eventually at an agreement. If it was a boy, they would call him Samuel, after her father. If it was a girl, they would call her Frances, a name that had belonged to his grandmother and that Edith said sounded like a woman who didn't take nonsense from anyone. "How do you know what Frances sounds like?" he said. "Names have sounds," she said, with the certainty of a person who has thought about this and isn't interested in debating it. "All right," he said. Samuel arrived on a February night in 1887, delivered by the midwife who had ridden out through half a foot of new snow, because Edith had sent for her 2 days earlier when she'd felt the early signs, and who arrived with exactly enough time to be useful. Roscoe had been allowed to stay in the house, which the midwife, a stout practical woman named Mrs. Haverford, said was unusual, and for which she gave him a look that suggested he should be grateful and quiet. He was both. He sat in the main room and listened to the sounds from the back of the house and held onto the edge of the table and thought about all the worst things that could happen, because that's what fathers do in those hours, and he was a father now. This was already true, whatever happened. Then he heard the thin, outraged cry of a new creature encountering the world for the first time, and finding it smaller and colder than expected. And Mrs. Haverford appeared in the doorway and said, "A boy, good lungs, come and see your son." Samuel Weston came into the world with a head full of dark hair like his mother's, and a set of opinions about everything that he expressed loudly and at length, which also seemed like his mother's influence. He was small and warm and perfect in the way that all new life is perfect before the world gets to work on it, and Roscoe held him that first night with a care that surprised him with its intensity, this new weight in his arms. Edith, tired and luminous and satisfied, watched him hold the baby and said, "You look different." "Different how?" he said, not looking up from Samuel. "Like something that was braced up has let go," she said. He thought about that. He thought she was probably right. Samuel grew the way babies do, fast and observable, day by day acquiring new capacities that each one felt like a small miracle to a man who hadn't expected to be present for them. He grew into a sturdy, curious, red-cheeked baby who regarded the world with wide, dark eyes and wanted to touch everything, and was not deterred by the word no as much as his parents would have found convenient. Roscoe found himself doing things he hadn't expected, sitting on the floor with the boy while he stacked blocks and knocked them over, carrying him out to see the horses in the morning, and narrating the horses' names and personalities as if Samuel understood him, which he gradually, actually, began to. Dolores was the child's devoted honorary aunt. She came for Samuel's first birthday with a stuffed cloth horse she'd made herself, which was Samuel's favorite object for the next 2 years. Floyd and Nora Caldwell came and brought honey from their hives and apple preserves, and the large warmth of people who have been waiting for good things to happen to someone they care about, and are pleased to have been right. Roscoe stood in his yard that spring afternoon, Samuel on his hip, Edith beside him, and looked at the people gathered around his table on the porch. And then he looked at his land, the south pasture green and full, the creek running bright and cold, the mountains beyond still white at the peaks, and he felt a fullness in his chest that he recognized now. had learned to recognize in the year and a half since Edith Talmadge had knocked on his door with her dripping coat and her steady voice and her eyes the color of Winter Creek water. This was happiness. Real, unambiguous, unsentimental happiness. Not the absence of grief or difficulty or the memory of loss, but something that existed alongside all of that and was not diminished by it. He reached over and took Edith's hand, and she curled her fingers through his without looking away from the conversation she was having with Nora, just the easy automatic gesture of two people for whom touch has become a natural language. The ranch grew. Not spectacularly. This wasn't the kind of story where fortune comes in a rush and changes everything overnight. It grew the way honest work grows, steadily, one season at a time, one good decision compounding another. By 1889, they had 30 head of cattle and had taken on a hired hand, a young man of 22 named Garrett, who had come through Durango on his way to somewhere else, and ended up staying because Roscoe offered him fair wages and Edith fed him suppers that made leaving feel unreasonable. Garrett was from Arkansas and had an easy manner and genuine skill with horses, and he and Abel got along particularly well, which was a better character reference than anything written. He worked hard and didn't complain, and had enough sense to understand that a hired man's job was to help build something that belonged to someone else, and to take satisfaction in that. Samuel, now 2, considered Garrett his personal entertainment and followed him around the barn making commentary in a language that was partly words and partly determined inference, and Garrett took this supervisory role with great patience and good humor. In the fall of 1889, Edith told Roscoe that Samuel was going to have a sibling. Roscoe heard this news standing in the middle of the kitchen, and he crossed to her and put his arms around her, just held her in the kitchen light, and she leaned against him for a moment, and he pressed his lips to the top of her head and thought that 40 had been the beginning, not the end, that he had been so completely wrong about what 40 meant. He was 44 now. He felt 30. He felt like a man who had been given back time he'd thought was gone. The second child arrived in May of 1890 and was the girl they'd agreed to name Frances, and she was born with her father's blue eyes and her mother's look of determined evaluation. And within 6 months she was running the household's emotional life with the unchallenged authority of a person who has figured out that she is exactly where she is supposed to be. Samuel adored her with the wholehearted, occasionally overwhelming affection of a 3-year-old, who has never had to compete for love and therefore has no instinct for jealousy, only enthusiasm. He brought her rocks and interesting sticks and demonstrated things for her approval, standing up on things he probably shouldn't be standing on and looking to see if she was watching. Roscoe watched his children and his wife and his land, and the nights when he'd sat in that cold, dark house and decided he was finished seemed like something that had happened to a different man, which in a sense they had, because the man sitting in that cold, dark house hadn't yet known that the morning was coming. The morning and the woman in it. Dollars in 1890 began a quiet and then not-so-quiet courtship with a man named Ezekiel Monroe, a freed black man who had come west after the war and established himself as the best leather worker in Durango and possibly the county. He was 41, dignified and generous, with large hands that made things of beauty, and a particular brand of quiet humor that he deployed so subtly you sometimes laughed a full 3 seconds after the joke. He and Dollars had been friends for 2 years before either of them admitted they were more than that, and when they came to dinner at the Weston Ranch for the first time as an acknowledged couple, Edith served them the best supper she could manage and treated their relationship with exactly the matter-of-fact respect she'd have given anyone she cared about. They faced considerable unkindness from certain quarters of the town, the compound ignorance of people who objected to Dollars' Mexican heritage, to Ezekiel's race, to either, to both, to the fact of their being together. Roscoe had, in the first years of knowing Dollars, noticed the way certain establishments in Durango treated her as lesser, and had responded by doing his business specifically with the establishments that did not, and by saying clearly when asked that he didn't see the sense in it. After Ezekiel came into the picture, he extended the same position. It wasn't heroism. He was clear-eyed about that. He was a white man with land and standing, and his position cost him little, while Dolers and Ezekiel paid for their dignity in a currency that was extracted every day. What he could do was refuse to add to the cost, and he and Edith did that. And over time, a few other families in the area did the same. And the town, in the incremental and uneven way that towns do, began to shift. Dolers and Ezekiel were married in 1891 in the kitchen of Roscoe and Edith's ranch house, because neither of them wanted a church ceremony given the range of church's views on their situation, and because the kitchen had become, over the years, a place that had seen enough good human moments to be considered a proper venue for another one. Edith made the wedding supper and Roscoe opened the good wine he'd been keeping since the previous fall, and Samuel, who was 4, wore his good shirt and stood very seriously throughout the ceremony, as if appointed to ensure things went correctly. And Francis, who was 1, sat on Floyd Caldwell's knee and tried to eat his hat. Reverend Hayes performed the ceremony with the same kind directness he'd brought to Roscoe and Edith's wedding, and at the end of it Dolers and Ezekiel were married, and the kitchen was warm and full of people who wished them well, and outside the Colorado Spring was doing the work of renewing everything, same as it always did. By 1893, the Weston Ranch had 45 head of cattle and 2 hired hands, Garrett having stayed on and been joined by a Ute man named James Cutter, who had come south from the reservation area looking for work after the displacement policies of the government had narrowed the options of his people to something that made Roscoe angry when he thought about it too clearly. James was quiet and extraordinarily capable, better with land and animals than anyone Roscoe had ever worked with, and he treated the ranch with a kind of careful attentiveness that Roscoe eventually understood was the way his people related to land when it was being treated with respect rather than simply exploited. They had an understanding between them that didn't require many words, the understanding of 2 men who had both seen something broken and were trying to build something whole, each from their own angle. Samuel was 6 that year and Francis was 3, and the house that had been so empty and cold 8 years before was now full of exactly the kind of noise and life that makes a house into something more than walls and roof. Samuel had begun riding, a natural horseman from the first day he got on a horse, which he did at 5 and which required Edith's cooperation because Roscoe wasn't sure he was ready and Edith said he was clearly ready and that Roscoe was the one who wasn't. She was right. Francis was a different kind of child, quieter and more observant, interested in everything but selective about what she chose to engage with, which meant that when she did engage she did so with a completeness that was startling in a 3-year-old. She had her mother's gray eyes and her father's patience, and something that was entirely her own, a particular quality of seeing, as if she was assembling a picture of the world that she would eventually have a great deal to say about. One October evening in 1893, Roscoe and Edith sat on the porch after the children were in bed, which was a thing they did in the good weather months whenever they could, a quiet end to busy days. The mountains were going through their autumn transformation, the aspens on the high slopes already turned to gold, and the evening air had that crystalline quality that preceded the first serious cold. 8 years, Edith said. 8 years, he agreed. She turned to look at him, and she looked at him for a moment with the same careful attention she'd been giving him since the morning she'd stood on his porch in the rain, as if she was still reading him, still finding new chapters. He didn't mind. He liked being read by her. He trusted what she found there. "Are you happy?" she said. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "You sounded very certain," she said, something warm in her voice. "I am very certain," he said. "I was not always certain. There was a season when I was the opposite of certain. He looked at the mountains. But that was before you knocked on my door. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she did sometimes, this woman who was generally not much given to leaning, and he put his arm around her and they sat in the October evening together. I was terrified that morning, she said. I know, he said. Did you know then? That you were terrified, yes. And you let me in anyway. You needed to come in, he said simply. The rain was coming down and your horse looked miserable and you'd come a long way. It seemed like the least I could do. She laughed softly. The least you could do. 8 years ago you did the least you could do, and here we are. Here we are, he agreed. The fire in the house behind them crackled through the open window, and the evening star was up over the mountains, and from inside they could hear Samuel's voice, still awake despite the hour, telling Frances what sounded like an elaborate story involving horses and adventure, and Frances's occasional interjections suggesting that the story needed more horses. Roscoe listened to his children's voices, and felt Edith's weight against his side, and breathed the cold Colorado air, and was grateful. Not in a complicated or philosophical way, but in the direct, uncomplicated way of a man who has been given something he wasn't expecting and knows it. He had been 40, and he had been done, and he had been wrong. The years continued to be good. Not easy. Ranching was never easy and life was never easy, but good in the way that things with genuine substance to them are good. They had seasons of plenty and seasons where the numbers were tight and they were careful, and they had the occasional difficulty that the West produced by nature and circumstance. A bad winter in 1896 that took 4 head of cattle and required serious belt tightening. A summer where the creek ran low, and the water rights with the neighboring operations became a matter of tense negotiation. A year where Garrett fell from a horse and broke his collarbone and they were short-handed for 3 months. They navigated all of it, because they were two people who had both learned, before they found each other, how to navigate difficulty alone, and together they were considerably better at it than either of them had been. Samuel, as he grew, showed himself to be his father's son in his patience and his love of the land, and his mother's son in his directness and his refusal to accept something that didn't make sense to him just because someone older had said it. He was a good boy and then a good young man, and by 13 he was as useful on the ranch as an adult, which Edith periodically pointed out they shouldn't take too much advantage of, and Roscoe agreed, and they were both right. Frances grew into the girl Edith had named correctly without knowing it, a girl who indeed did not take nonsense from anyone, and who had a particular quality of attention, of noticing things, that her parents both found astonishing and occasionally exhausting. She wanted to know the reason for everything, not in the way of a child who wants attention, but in the way of a child who genuinely cannot be satisfied with the surface of anything and needs to understand what's underneath it. By the time she was 8, she could read anything in the house, had worked through Edith's Wollstonecraft and pronounced it important, had read the almanacs and seed catalogs, and the Bible and a novel Dollars had brought out from Durango, and was beginning on a history of the American West that James Cutter, who had more formal education than most people assumed, had lent her from his own small collection. She told Roscoe one evening, with the directness that was her most persistent characteristic, that the history book got a lot of things wrong about the people who'd been living on the land before settlers came, and that she thought James probably knew things that weren't in the book. He probably does, Roscoe said. Can I ask him about it? That's up to James, Roscoe said, but if he's willing, I don't see why not. James was willing, and the conversations between the 8-year-old daughter of his employer and himself became something that both of them clearly valued, though they were the most unlikely pair in the county, and the education Frances was receiving about the actual history of the land she lived on was richer and more honest than anything available in the Durango schoolhouse. Roscoe and Edith talked about this one evening, about what it meant to raise children on land that had a complicated history, about their responsibility to tell the truth about it, about what it meant that James was here because his options had been systematically taken away. "We can't fix the whole of it," Edith said. "No," Roscoe agreed. "But we can refuse to pretend it didn't happen," she said. "And we can make sure the children know what they're standing on." He looked at her, the woman who had read her Wollstonecraft on his porch and argued with him about the rights of women and who would not ever look away from the parts of the world that were unjust simply because the injustice didn't land on her. "Yes," he said, "that we can do." In 1899, Roscoe turned 54, and Edith was 50, and Samuel was 12 and Francis was 9. And the ranch had 60 head of cattle and 4 hired hands, and a root cellar that was properly repaired, and a kitchen window that had good glass in it, and a porch with chairs on it that got used most evenings of the warm season. Floyd Caldwell had slowed down in the past few years, the big body that had always seemed built to last going gradually quieter, and Nora managed more of their smaller operation than she used to. They still came for supper every few weeks, and Floyd still had opinions on everything and offered them freely, and Roscoe still alternated between appreciating and being exasperated by the man who had sent a drenched woman with a carpet bag to his door on a November morning, and thereby changed the entire rest of his life. He had told Floyd so, once. Not in those precise words, because he was not a man who said things in precise words when plain ones would do. He'd said on a summer evening when they were sitting on the Weston porch after supper, and the women were inside talking and the sound of their voices came through the open window, that Floyd had been right, and that he was glad Floyd had been the kind of man who interfered in things. Floyd had looked at him with the red-faced directness he'd always had and said, "I knew you needed someone." "You could have been wrong," Roscoe said. "I could have been," Floyd agreed. "But you needed someone regardless." She was just the specific someone who came along. Roscoe thought about that. "She's more than that," he said. "I know she is," Floyd said. "That's why it worked." There was a night in the fall of that year, 1899, when Roscoe woke in the small hours and lay in the dark, and did what he sometimes still did, though far less frequently than he once had, ran through the accounting of his life and measured what was there. He was 54. He was, by any honest measure, not a young man. His back told him so every morning, and his knees confirmed it, and the mirror showed him a face that had been thoroughly used by weather and time and a full life. And he was lying in a house that was warm and real, beside a woman who was asleep with her dark hair, still mostly dark though threaded now with gray, spread on the pillow, her breathing slow, and even her presence beside him the most natural and necessary thing in the world. Down the hall his children were asleep, his son who was going to be a good man and his daughter who was already a formidable person in miniature. Outside his cattle were in the pasture and his horses were in the barn, and the land ran south toward Durango under a sky full of Colorado stars. He had been 40, and he had been cold, and he had been done. He had been wrong. He lay in the dark beside Edith and felt the warmth of her beside him and thought about the morning 14 years ago when the knock had come on his door, 3 deliberate knocks, and he'd opened it to find a drenched woman who said, with her steady voice and her clear gray eyes, "My name is Edith Talmadge. I've come from Springfield, Missouri." And because he had stepped back from the door and she had come in, everything that followed had been possible. He reached over and took her hand in the dark, the capable, warm hand he knew better than his own now. She stirred slightly in her sleep and turned toward him without waking, and he held her hand in the dark and listened to the quiet that was full of all the things that were his, and went back to sleep. By the early years of the new century, the Weston Ranch had become something that Roscoe could not have imagined from the perspective of that cold November evening when he'd sat in his unlit house and decided the remaining years were simply to be gotten through. It was a real operation now, not a struggling one. The cattle numbered near 80 head. Samuel, at 15, was learning everything his father could teach him about running the land and had ideas of his own that were often good. Francis, at 12, had begun riding with an authority that startled visitors who didn't expect it from a girl her age, and had an ongoing correspondence with a woman in Denver who was involved in the push for women's suffrage, which Edith had encouraged and Roscoe had made no objection to because he had learned long ago that the women in his household were going to have opinions about the rights of women, and that the correct response was to support them, which he did sincerely. James Cutter was still with the ranch, older and no less skilled, and his friendship with Roscoe had grown into something genuine and mutual over the years, the kind of friendship that doesn't make a fuss about itself, but is clearly real when you look at it. Garrett had eventually moved on to start his own operation further north, which Roscoe had helped him with in the way of a man who understood what it meant to be trying to build something. But the parting had been warm and Garrett came by when he was through the area. Dolers and Ezekiel had built a good life in Durango, the leather shop growing, and the laundry established enough to support 2 assistants. They had no children of their own, which was a grief they carried quietly, but they had Samuel and Frances as near family, and the Sunday dinners they came for at the Weston Ranch were loud and cheerful and anchored in the particular warmth of people who have chosen each other as family without being required to. One Sunday in the spring of 1902, they were all at the table, all of them, Floyd and Nora, Dolers and Ezekiel, James Cutter, Garrett who happened to be through, and the Weston family at the center of it all. And the kitchen was full of the noise of too many people talking at once, and the food was good, and the windows were open to the spring air. Samuel, who was 15 now and had shot up in the past year to be taller than his father, was arguing with Floyd about the best approach to the water rights question that was an ongoing consideration in the valley. And Floyd was arguing back with the full-voiced pleasure of a man who loves a good argument and has met a young one who is capable of providing one. Frances was sitting next to Dolers, and they were having a conversation that required both of them to lean together over the table, which suggested it was something serious or interesting or both. Roscoe sat at the head of the table and looked down the length of it, and Edith sat at the other end and caught his eye across the noise and the food and the people they both loved, and she smiled at him, the quick, real smile that was still, after all these years, his favorite thing in the county. He smiled back. He thought about what 40 had looked like from the inside of it, that cold, dark November, the ash in the fireplace, the shutters coming off in the wind, the decision he'd made about what the rest of his life was going to be. He thought about 3 knocks on a door. He thought about a woman in a brown traveling coat with a piece of paper in her hand and steady gray eyes, and a voice that didn't waver even when the rest of her was soaked and cold and far from everything she knew. He thought about how a person can be absolutely wrong about themselves without knowing it, can be certain that what they are is finished when what they actually are is not yet begun. Edith looked at him from the end of the table with the same careful attention she'd been paying him for 17 years, still finding things in him worth looking at, still choosing this life and this man in every daily thing she did, and he was the same, would be the same for however many years were left to them, which he intended to be many. He raised his glass toward her, just slightly, just between the 2 of them. She raised hers back. The table was loud around them, and the spring was outside the windows, and the children were growing, and the land was good, and the years ahead were full of ordinary, extraordinary days, the kind that accumulate into something irreplaceable, the kind that add up to a life that was worth every difficult thing it took to reach. 40, Roscoe Weston had decided, was the end. He had never in his life been more wrong or more glad of it.